The dust hung in the air like a question no one dared to answer. It was April 1945, and the convoy of trucks rumbled through the Texas plains under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. In the back of the lead vehicle, 23 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their uniforms faded and torn, their faces carved with exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. They had crossed an ocean in the belly of a ship, survived the chaos of surrender, and now found themselves in a landscape that looked nothing like the war-torn Europe they'd left behind. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Klaus Hoffman pressed his forehead against the wooden slat of the truck bed, watching the endless prairie roll past. He was 24 years old, though his eyes held the weariness of someone twice that age. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher in a small village outside Munich, teaching children about literature and mathematics, about the world beyond their valley. Now he was prisoner number 31847, being transported to a place called Camp Hearne, a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the heart of Texas. Beside him sat Ernst Weber, a former mechanic from Hamburg with hands that still bore the scars of machinery and battle. Ernst had barely spoken since they'd boarded the ship in Le Havre. His younger brother had died at Monte Cassino, and something inside Ernst had gone quiet after that, like a radio tuned to static. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" whispered Johann, a boy of barely 19 with a constellation of freckles across his pale cheeks. His accent was thick, his English practically non-existent. Klaus didn't answer immediately. He'd learned during the war that false comfort was worse than silence. "No," he finally said. "If they wanted us dead, we wouldn't be here." The truck lurched over a pothole, and the men swayed as one organism, their bodies pressed together by necessity and circumstance. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Klaus could see a landscape that defied everything he'd imagined about America. There were no skyscrapers, no industrial smokestacks, no evidence of the mighty war machine that had crushed the Third Reich. Instead, there were miles of golden grassland, clusters of cattle grazing beneath the relentless sun, and occasionally, in the distance, wooden structures that looked impossibly small against the enormity of the land. The convoy slowed, then stopped entirely. Klaus heard voices outside. American voices, deep and relaxed, nothing like the clipped military commands he'd grown accustomed to. Someone laughed, an easy sound that seemed alien in the context of prisoners and guards. Then the canvas flap at the back of the truck was pulled aside, flooding the interior with blinding sunlight. "All right, boys, everybody out," said the American sergeant, a stocky man with a sunburned nose and a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Welcome to Texas." The prisoners climbed down one by one, their legs stiff from hours of travel. Klaus was the fifth to emerge, and when his boots hit the red dirt, he had to shield his eyes against the glare. The heat was different here, dry and penetrating, not at all like the damp cold of the European winter they'd left behind. But it wasn't the heat that made Klaus freeze in place. It was the men on horseback. There were 6 of them, sitting atop their mounts with an ease that suggested they'd been born in the saddle. They wore wide-brimmed hats that cast shadows across weathered faces, their clothes a patchwork of denim and leather, their boots worn and dusty. Each man had a rope coiled at his hip, and their horses, massive animals with coats that gleamed copper and chestnut in the sun, stood perfectly still, as if they too were sizing up the newcomers. Klaus had seen cowboys in picture books as a child, those romanticized images of the American West that German publishers had imported before the war. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of them. These weren't characters from a dime novel. They were real men, their presence commanding and utterly foreign, their silence somehow louder than any shouting. The tallest of the cowboys nudged his horse forward. He was older than the others, perhaps in his 50s, with a face like carved sandstone and eyes that held both humor and hardness in equal measure. A silver belt buckle caught the light as his horse took 2 lazy steps toward the assembled prisoners. "Name's Hank Morrow," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We'll be working together these next few months. You boys are going to help us bring in the spring cattle, repair fences, and get this ranch ready for summer." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the Germans. You work hard, you eat well. You cause trouble, you'll wish you hadn't. Simple as that. One of the American guards translated, though Klaus understood most of it. His English was better than he'd let on, a useful advantage in uncertain circumstances. Ernst shifted beside him, his mouth slightly open. They put us on a ranch? He muttered in German. To work with cowboys? Apparently, Klaus replied softly. A younger cowboy, perhaps 25, with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat, leaned forward in his saddle. That one speaks English, he said, nodding toward Klaus. His accent was thick, stretched out like taffy, each word taking its time. Heard him translate for the others on the way here. Hank Morrow's eyes found Klaus, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Klaus refused to look away, some stubborn part of him unwilling to be the first to break contact. Finally, Hank nodded just once, an acknowledgement that registered somewhere between respect and challenge. What's your name, son? Klaus Hoffman. You understand what I said about the work? Yes, sir. Good. Hank turned his horse with a subtle shift of his weight, addressing the entire group again. Barracks are half a mile that way. You'll be bunking together 12 to a building. Mess hall serves breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. You miss it, you go hungry. Questions? No one spoke. The prisoners stood in a ragged line, their shadows stretching long across the red earth, their faces a mixture of confusion, exhaustion, and something else, a flicker of disbelief that they'd survived the war only to end up here, in this strange liminal space between captivity and something that almost resembled normalcy. All right then, Hank said. Torres, you take half of them to Barracks 3. Colt, you take the rest to Barracks 5. Get them settled. Then bring them to the corral in an hour. We're burning daylight. The cowboys moved with practiced efficiency, their horses responding to commands Klaus couldn't even perceive. The prisoners were divided and led away, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. As Klaus walked, he noticed details he'd missed before. The way the fence posts were weathered to silver gray, the cluster of buildings in the distance that must be the main ranch house, the windmill turning slowly against the blue expanse of sky. Barracks 3 was a long, low structure made of rough-hewn wood, with windows covered by mesh screens and a roof that looked like it had been patched many times. Inside, it smelled of pine and dust and something indefinably American. A scent Klaus couldn't quite place but that seemed to permeate everything in this new world. Ernst chose a bunk near the back, dropping his small pack on the thin mattress. Cowboys, he said again, shaking his head. This is insane. It's better than a prison cell, Klaus said, selecting the bunk beside Ernst's. At least we're outside. Johann sat on his bunk, his young face pale despite the heat. Do you think they hate us? Klaus considered the question. He thought about Hank Morrow's eyes, about the way the cowboys had looked at them, not with hatred, but with something closer to wary curiosity. I don't know, he admitted, but I think we're about to find out. An hour later, as promised, the prisoners were assembled at the corral, a large circular pen made of wooden rails that enclosed a space of packed earth. The 6 cowboys were there, along with the American guards who'd accompanied them from the coast. But it was the horses that drew Klaus's attention. A dozen of them, powerful and restless, moving within the confines of the corral like living sculptures. Hank Morrow stood at the gate, one boot propped on the lowest rail. Any of you boys ever worked with horses? The translator repeated the question in German. A few hands went up tentatively, including Ernst's. Klaus raised his slowly, remembering summers on his uncle's farm, though those had been draft horses, nothing like these rangy American breeds. Good, Hank said. He whistled, sharp and clear, and the red-headed cowboy, Colt, Klaus remembered, brought forward a gray horse with a black mane. The animal tossed its head, nostrils flaring, clearly unimpressed with the crowd of strangers. This is Smoke, Hank said, running a hand along the horse's neck in a gesture that was both casual and deeply familiar. He's gentle enough if you know what you're doing. Trouble is, most of you don't. He fixed his gaze on the prisoners again. We're gonna spend the next week teaching you the basics. How to approach a horse. How to saddle one. How to sit in the saddle without falling off or getting kicked. Pay attention, work hard, and by the end of it you might actually be useful. What followed was unlike anything Klaus had experienced in his years as a soldier or a prisoner. The cowboys moved among them with a patience he hadn't expected, demonstrating how to hold a halter, how to speak to a horse in low, steady tones, how to move around the animals without startling them. Colt worked with the younger prisoners, his instructions simple and clear, occasionally breaking into a grin when one of the Germans successfully got a horse to accept a saddle. Hank took the more experienced men, including Klaus and Ernst. He placed a rope in Klaus's hands, the fibers rough against his palms. "You ever lasso anything?" "No, sir." "Then today's your lucky day." Hank demonstrated, his movements fluid and precise, the loop of rope sailing through the air to settle around a fence post 20 feet away. He made it look effortless. "It's all in the wrist and the timing. You force it, you'll miss every time. You let it flow, the rope does the work." Klaus tried and failed 5 times in a row. The rope tangled, fell short, or missed the post entirely. Beside him, Ernst was having similar luck, cursing quietly in German each time his loop collapsed. "You're thinking too much," Hank said to Klaus, retrieving his rope. "It's not a math problem. It's a conversation between you and the rope and whatever you're trying to catch. Feel it." It was the strangest instruction Klaus had ever received, but he tried again, this time focusing less on technique and more on the weight of the rope in his hand, the arc it wanted to make. His 6th throw went wide, but his 7th caught the post, the loop settling with a satisfying thunk. "There you go," Hank said, and Klaus thought he detected the faintest hint of approval in the cowboy's voice. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Klaus had never seen in Europe, the prisoners were led to the mess hall. It was a communal building with long tables and benches, the smell of food so rich and unexpected that Klaus felt his stomach twist with sudden, desperate hunger. The meal was simple: beef stew with potatoes and carrots, thick slices of bread, and coffee so strong it could probably strip paint. But to men who'd survived on prison rations, it was a feast. Klaus ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching the cowboys at their own table across the room. They laughed easily, their bodies relaxed, occasionally glancing over at the Germans with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild amusement. "This doesn't feel like being a prisoner," Johann said quietly, tearing his bread into smaller pieces as if to make it last longer. "Don't be fooled," Ernst replied. "We're still prisoners, just ones they can use." But Klaus wasn't sure that was entirely true. Something about this place felt different, though he couldn't articulate what. Maybe it was the openness of the land, or the way the cowboys treated the work as a kind of partnership rather than punishment. Or maybe it was simply the absence of barbed wire and machine guns, replaced instead by horses and rope and the endless sky. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. After dinner, as darkness settled over the ranch and the prisoners returned to their barracks, Klaus stood outside for a moment, looking up at the stars. They were the same stars he'd seen over Germany, over the battlefields of France, over the deck of the ship that brought him here. But somehow, in this place, they looked different, brighter, closer, more numerous. "You thinking about home?" a voice asked in English. Klaus turned to find Colt leaning against the barracks wall, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. "Always," Klaus admitted. Colt nodded, taking a drag. "Yeah, I imagine you are." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "For what it's worth, I've got a cousin who fought in Europe, saw some bad things, came back different." He looked at Klaus then, his young face serious. "I figure you probably saw some bad things too." Klaus didn't know how to respond to that, to this unexpected thread of humanity offered in the darkness. "Yes," he finally said, "I did." "Well," Colt said, pushing off from the wall, "maybe this place can be different. Maybe working the land, working with the animals, maybe that helps. I don't know." He dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his boot. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start with the fences, and that's harder than the horses. He walked away, leaving Klaus alone with the stars and a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something fragile and unfamiliar, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. Hope, perhaps, or simply the possibility of it. The days began to blur together, marked not by dates on a calendar but by the rhythm of ranch work and the slow transformation of frightened prisoners into something else entirely. Men with purpose, however temporary and strange that purpose might be. Klaus woke each morning to the sound of a bell ringing across the camp, its metallic clang cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. He would lie there for a moment, disoriented, expecting to hear artillery fire or the shouts of commanding officers. Instead, there was only the rustling of other men rising from their bunks, the creak of floorboards, the soft murmur of German voices planning the day ahead. The work was brutal in its simplicity. Fence repair meant digging post holes in earth that had been baked hard by the sun, stretching wire until their hands bled through their gloves, hammering until their shoulders screamed. The cowboys worked alongside them, never asking the prisoners to do anything they wouldn't do themselves. Hank Morrow moved through the work with the steady endurance of someone who'd been doing this his entire life, his weathered hands making quick work of knots and repairs that took Klaus 3 times as long. "You're getting better," Hank said one afternoon, watching Klaus secure a length of wire to a post. They were 3 miles from the main ranch, in a section of pasture where the fence had been damaged by weather and time. "Still too slow, but better." Klaus straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The Texas sun was merciless, a constant weight pressing down on everything. "In Germany, I was a teacher," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "Not a rancher." Hank considered this, his eyes scanning the horizon where heat waves distorted the air into liquid shimmer. "What did you teach?" "Literature, mathematics, history." Klaus paused. "Though I suppose the history I taught was incomplete." It was as close as he'd come to acknowledging the propaganda that had saturated German education, the lies he'd been forced to repeat or lose his position. Hank didn't respond immediately, just pulled a canteen from his belt and took a long drink before offering it to Klaus. "My daddy used to say that every man's got to reckon with what he's done," Hank finally said. "Or what he's been part of, even if he didn't choose it. That reckoning, that's between you and God or you and yourself, depending on what you believe." He adjusted his hat against the glare. "Out here, what matters is whether you pull your weight and treat others decent. That's about the size of it." Klaus drank from the canteen, the water warm but welcome. He wanted to explain that he'd never believed in the Nazi ideology, that he'd kept his head down and survived, that he'd tried in small ways to protect the children in his care from the worst of it. But he also knew that survival itself was a kind of complicity, that there were no clean hands in a dirty war. "I'll work hard," he said instead. "That much I can promise." "I know you will," Hank replied. "Already seen it." Ernst, meanwhile, was having a different kind of transformation. The mechanic from Hamburg had been assigned to work with the ranch's equipment. The ancient tractor that coughed black smoke, the various tools and machines that kept the operation running. He spent his days in a shed that smelled of grease and gasoline, his hands once again covered in oil, his mind engaged in the puzzle of making broken things work. The cowboy working with him was named Raymond Torres, the oldest of the group at perhaps 60, with silver streaking his black hair and a face that spoke of both Mexican and native heritage. Raymond spoke less than the others, but when he did, his words carried weight. "This engine," Ernst said one morning, pointing to the tractor's exposed mechanics. "It's running too rich, needs the carburetor adjusted." Raymond nodded slowly. "You're right. You know how to do it." Ernst's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years in machine shops. Within 20 minutes, he had the carburetor disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled, the adjustments made with precision. When Raymond started the engine, it purred, or at least, it ran without the violent coughing that had characterized it before. "Good work?" Raymond said, and something in Ernst's face shifted, a hint of pride breaking through the grief that had settled there like sediment. They worked in companionable silence after that, Raymond occasionally asking Ernst's opinion on repairs, Ernst slowly remembering that he was good at something, that his hands could build as well as they'd been forced to destroy. Johann, the youngest of the prisoners, struggled more than the others. He'd been a farm boy before conscription, but German farming was nothing like Texas ranching. The horses intimidated him, their size and power overwhelming. The heat exhausted him. The loneliness, the vast empty loneliness of the prairie, seemed to hollow him out day by day. Colt noticed. One evening, as the others headed to dinner, Colt caught Johann's arm. "Come with me," he said in his limited German. "Want to show you something." They walked past the barracks, past the corral, to a smaller pen where a single horse stood. A young mare, maybe 3 years old, with a coat the color of dark honey. "This is Marigold," Colt said, switching back to English and gesturing for Johann to climb the fence. "She's green. Means she's not fully trained yet. Skittish. Doesn't trust easy." He pulled an apple from his pocket and handed it to Johann. "But she's gentle if you're gentle with her." Johann held the apple uncertainly, looking between Colt and the horse. "Hold it flat on your palm," Colt demonstrated with his own hand. "Let her come to you. Don't force it." Johann extended his hand, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then Marigold took a tentative step forward. Her ears pricked, her large eyes cautious. Another step. Another. Finally, her soft muzzle touched Johann's palm, and she took the apple with surprising delicacy, crunching it while Johann stood frozen, barely breathing. "See," Colt said quietly, "you just needed something that's learning too. Something that's as uncertain as you are." After that, Johann spent every spare moment with Marigold, bringing her treats, talking to her in German while she listened with patient incomprehension. The other prisoners teased him about it, but gently, recognizing that the boy had found something to anchor him in this strange new world. The transformation wasn't just happening to the Germans, though. The Cowboys, too, were changing in subtle ways. Hank found himself thinking about the war differently, not as an abstract conflict across an ocean, but as something that had scarred these particular men in ways he could only partially imagine. He watched Klaus teach Ernst how to read English using an old newspaper from the main house, saw the way the former teacher's face lit up when Ernst successfully decoded a headline. He noticed Raymond and Ernst developing a shorthand in the workshop, communicating through gestures and the shared language of machinery. He saw Colt sneaking extra rations to Johann when the boy looked particularly thin and tired. One night, sitting around a fire after a long day moving cattle, Hank voiced what several of them had been thinking. "They're not what I expected," he said, prodding the flames with a stick. "What did you expect?" asked Leo, the youngest of the regular ranch hands, a Mexican-American kid from San Antonio who'd been too young for the draft. "I don't know. Monsters, maybe. Or at least men who looked like enemies." Hank shook his head. "But they just look tired. And young. Jesus, they're so young." "The one with the mechanic skills," Raymond said. "His brother died in Italy. He told me about it yesterday. Said he couldn't fix what was broken in him." They sat with that for a while, the fire crackling, the vast darkness of the prairie surrounding them like a living thing. "My nephew was killed at Normandy," said Buck, a cowboy who rarely spoke about personal matters. "Got the telegram last June. He was 20 years old." He stared into the fire. "I wanted to hate all Germans after that. Thought it would be easy when they showed up here. But that kid, Johann, he reminds me of my nephew. Same awkward way of moving. Same nervous laugh." Colt leaned back, looking at the stars. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Maybe we're supposed to see that they're just people. That the real enemy was never them, but the bastards who sent them to fight in the first place." It was perhaps the most philosophical thing Colt had ever said, and the others regarded him with mild surprise. "When'd you get so wise?" Hank asked, a smile tugging at his weathered face. "Must be the company I'm keeping," Colt replied with a grin. By the third week, the routines had solidified into something approaching normalcy. Klaus could rope a fence post with reasonable accuracy. Ernst had repaired every piece of equipment on the ranch and was now teaching some of the younger prisoners basic mechanics. Johann could saddle Marigold without assistance and was beginning to ride her around the corral, his confidence growing with each circuit. But normalcy didn't mean the absence of pain or memory. Klaus still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, his heart racing from dreams of artillery fire and burning cities. He would lie in his bunk, listening to the breathing of the other men, grounding himself in the present by cataloging the differences. Wooden walls instead of concrete, the smell of hay instead of cordite, silence instead of screaming. One such night, unable to sleep, he went outside and found Hank sitting on the corral fence, smoking a pipe, the tobacco's sweet smoke drifting into the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Hank asked without turning. Klaus climbed up to sit beside him. "The dreams," he said simply. Hank nodded. "My older brother fought in the First War. France. Came home in 1919 and couldn't sleep indoors for 2 years. Said the walls felt like a trap. He'd sleep in the barn or out under the stars until it finally eased up." He puffed on his pipe. He never talked much about what he saw. Didn't need to. We all knew it had changed him. "I killed men," Klaus said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Not many. I wasn't frontline infantry, but enough. I remember their faces." Hank was quiet for a long time. "You going to kill men here?" "No." "You going to work hard and treat others decent?" "Yes." "Then maybe that's your path forward. You can't unkill those men. But you can choose what kind of man you are from here on out." Hank knocked his pipe against the fence rail, scattering ash. "It's not forgiveness. That's between you and whoever you pray to. But it's something. It's a direction." Klaus felt something loosen in his chest, not absolution but perhaps permission. Permission to be more than the worst thing he'd ever done, permission to try. "Thank you," he said quietly. Hank just nodded, and they sat together in the darkness. Two men from different worlds finding common ground in silence and starlight. The next day brought a new challenge. A section of cattle needed to be moved from one pasture to another, a process that required coordination, skill, and trust between horse and rider. The prisoners were deemed ready enough to help, though they would be paired with experienced cowboys. Klaus found himself riding beside Hank on a chestnut gelding named Rusty, who'd been deemed gentle enough for a relative novice. The morning air was cool, the sun just beginning to heat the day, and Klaus felt a strange exhilaration as they moved across the open range. There was something deeply freeing about being on horseback, about moving through the landscape rather than walking through it, about the partnership between human and animal. The cattle were spread across a wide area, grazing peacefully until the riders approached. Then they began to move, a flowing mass of brown and white bodies, their lowing creating a low chorus across the grassland. Klaus's job was simple in theory, keep the stragglers from wandering off, but proved complex in execution. The cattle had minds of their own, and Rusty had his own ideas about how to work them. "Let him do his job," Hank called over. "He knows what he's doing better than you do." Klaus loosened his grip on the reins, trusting the horse, and immediately felt the difference. Rusty moved with purpose, cutting off a young steer that tried to bolt, positioning himself to guide the animal back toward the herd. Klaus was just a passenger along for the ride, and somehow that made everything easier. By the time they'd moved the entire herd to the new pasture and secured the gate, Klaus was exhausted, exhilarated, and covered in dust. Ernst rode up beside him, grinning wider than Klaus had seen him smile in months. "That was incredible," Ernst said in German. "Did you feel it? The way the horse just knew what to do." "I felt it," Klaus replied, and he realized he was grinning too. They rode back to the ranch in a loose group, prisoners and cowboys mixed together, the barriers between them not gone but definitely more porous. Colt was telling a story about a particularly stubborn bull, gesturing wildly with one hand while Johann tried to follow along with his limited English. Raymond and Ernst were discussing some modification to the tractor's cooling system. Buck was showing one of the other prisoners how to recoil a rope properly. And Klaus, riding beside Hank Morrow under the vast Texas sky, thought that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't about forgetting the past but about finding moments like this, where the present was real enough and good enough to coexist with the memories. That night at dinner, the usual separation between the cowboys' table and the prisoners' table blurred slightly. Colt sat down next to Johann to continue their conversation. Raymond joined Ernst to sketch out a design on a napkin. And when Buck made a joke in English that Klaus translated for the German speakers, both groups laughed together, the sound warm and unguarded. It was such a small thing, shared laughter over a meal, but it felt monumental, a tiny act of defiance against everything that had tried to make them see each other as less than human. Later, as Klaus wrote in the small journal he'd been given by the Red Cross, he tried to capture what was happening on this strange ranch in the middle of Texas. He wrote about the work and the cowboys, about Ernst's slow healing and Johann's growing confidence, about the way the land itself seemed to offer something he couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, but space. Space to be more than a soldier, more than a prisoner, more than a collection of regrets and losses. He wrote about Hank Morrow's rough wisdom, about Colt's unexpected kindness, about Raymond's patient teaching. He wrote about the horses and the cattle, about the endless sky and the way the stars looked different here, brighter somehow, as if even the universe was trying to remind him that there was more to existence than war and suffering. And he wrote about hope, that dangerous, fragile thing that he'd thought he'd lost somewhere on a battlefield in France but was finding again in the most unlikely place imaginable, in the company of former enemies who were teaching him, day by day, how to live again. The summer stretched long and hot across the Texas plains, and with it came a transformation none of them could have predicted that first dusty day in April. By August, the fence lines were repaired, the cattle rotated through fresh pasture, and the prisoners had become something the cowboys never expected, reliable partners. Klaus could rope with precision now, his teacher's mind having broken down the mechanics until his body understood instinctively. Ernst had not only repaired every machine on the ranch but had improved several, his modifications making the old equipment run better than it had in years. And Johann, shy, frightened Johann, could ride Marigold across the open range with a confidence that made even the seasoned cowboys nod in approval. The barriers hadn't disappeared entirely. They still slept in separate quarters, still had guards present during meals, still wore the markings that identified them as prisoners. But something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between the rules. One evening in late August, Hank announced that the fall cattle drive would happen in 2 weeks. It was the ranch's biggest undertaking, moving several hundred head to market, a multi-day journey that required every available hand. "You've earned the right to come along," he told the assembled prisoners, Klaus translating for those who still struggled with English. "If you want to, no man will be forced. But we could use you." Every hand went up. The drive itself was grueling. 12-hour days in the saddle, sleeping under stars, eating dust, chasing strays across ravines and through mesquite thickets. But there was also something transcendent about it, about being part of something larger than themselves, about the ancient rhythm of moving animals across land, about the way the line between prisoner and cowboy dissolved entirely when a steer decided to bolt and everyone, regardless of uniform or accent, worked together to bring it back. On the third night, sitting around a campfire while coyotes called in the distance, Hank pulled out a harmonica and played a mournful tune that needed no translation. When he finished, Ernst began singing, a German folk song about home and harvest, his rough voice carrying across the prairie. One by one, others joined in, both German and English voices blending in the darkness, creating something new from their different languages. Klaus looked around the fire at these men, former enemies, and realized that the war hadn't made them friends, exactly. The gulf of what had happened, of what they'd each lost, was too vast for something as simple as friendship, but it had made them something else. Witnesses to each other's humanity, partners in the daily work of survival and healing, proof that even after everything, connection was still possible. When they returned to the ranch, successful drive complete, there was a celebration. Barbecue and music, the ranch owner himself coming out to shake hands with cowboys and prisoners alike, thanking them for their work. Klaus noticed tears streaming down Johann's face as Colt clapped him on the back, laughing about how the boy had become a damn fine rider. He saw Raymond and Ernst embrace briefly, a moment of genuine affection between two men who'd built something meaningful in a workshop full of broken machines. The letter came in September. Klaus was working on a fence repair when the American sergeant found him, an official-looking envelope in his hand. His heart seized. Letters meant news, and news was rarely good. "It's from the Red Cross," the sergeant said. About repatriation. Klaus's hands trembled as he opened it. The war in Europe had been over for months, but the process of returning prisoners was slow, complicated by the devastation of Germany itself. The letter stated that he would be part of the next group returning home, departure scheduled for mid-October. He should have felt joy, relief, something. Instead, he felt torn, eager to return home, to search for whatever remained of his old life, but also strangely reluctant to leave this place that had become, against all odds, a kind of sanctuary. That night, he told Ernst and Johann. They'd received similar letters. Preparations began, the slow process of separating themselves from the routines they'd built, from the place and people who'd somehow helped them remember how to be human. On their last evening, Hank invited Klaus to sit with him one final time on the corral fence, the same spot where they talked that sleepless night months ago. "You're a good man, Klaus Hoffman," Hank said, his weathered face serious in the fading light. "Whatever you did during the war, and I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but what I've seen here is a man who works hard, treats others decent, and tries to do right. That counts for something." "Thank you," Klaus said, his throat tight, "for everything, for treating us like men instead of monsters." Hank nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all any of us can do. Treat each other like humans and hope it's enough." He extended his hand. "Good luck to you. And if you ever find yourself back in Texas, I'll know where to find work," Klaus finished, gripping the cowboy's hand firmly. The morning they left, the convoy of trucks returning them to the coast, the cowboys lined up to see them off. Colt gave Johann a small photograph of Marigold. Raymond pressed a tool into Ernst's hand, a wrench he'd used for decades, worn smooth by work and time, and Hank simply tipped his hat to Klaus, a gesture of respect that somehow meant more than words. As the truck pulled away, Klaus pressed his face to the wooden slat one last time, watching the ranch recede into the distance. The corral, the barracks, the endless prairie stretching toward a horizon he'd once feared but had learned to love. He was going home to face an uncertain future in a broken country, carrying memories of war that would never fully heal. But he was also carrying something else. The memory of this strange interlude, of cowboys who'd shown him that even enemies could find common ground, that healing was possible even when forgiveness wasn't, that sometimes the most unexpected places held the most profound grace. The dust hung in the air behind the convoy, and Klaus smiled through his tears, grateful beyond words for the cowboys who couldn't believe their eyes when they met German prisoners, and who'd chosen, day by day, to see men instead. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.